The click of the deadbolt sounded like a gunshot in the empty kitchen. Ivy froze, her bleeding lip stinging as she stared at the heavy oak door. Carmine stood there. He was a man who owned city judges and ordered executions before his morning coffee. He never set foot in the staff quarters. Until tonight. He didn't yell. He didn't draw a weapon. He just stared at the fresh purple bruising on her neck and asked a single question. Who did this? 3 a.m. is a dead hour. It's the time when the adrenaline of the day has fully evaporated, leaving nothing but the raw, aching reality of the bones. Ivy stood at the massive industrial sink in the basement kitchen of the estate. The water running over her hands was freezing, but she didn't adjust the tap. The numbness was the only thing keeping her grounded. In her right hand, she gripped a coarse, scrubbing sponge, dragging it in mindless, aggressive circles over the surface of an already pristine copper skillet. She wasn't washing the pan. She was trying to scrub away the lingering sensation of rough hands on her skin, the smell of cheap, stale beer, the terrifying realization of how small she was when pressed against a brick wall. A choked sob wrenched its way up her throat. She clamped her teeth down on her swollen lower lip to kill the sound-tasting copper. Her tears fell, silently dropping into the soapy water and vanishing. This kitchen was usually her sanctuary. The rest of the sprawling Gothic house above her was a fortress of silent, lethal men in expensive suits, moving millions of dollars in illicit cargo while eating catered meals. Ivy was just the hired help, a ghost in an apron. Keep your head down clean. The baseboards don't look at the soldiers collect the envelope of cash on Friday. That was the deal. It was a good deal, considering the suffocating medical debt her mother had left behind. But tonight the ghost was bleeding. Her ribs throbbed with a dull, rhythmic agony with every breath. Her left eye was swelling shut, a heavy, tight weight pulling down her cheek. The collar of her plain grey uniform was ripped, exposing the brutal, finger-shaped bruises forming on her collarbone. She dragged the sponge harder. Breathe. Just breathe. Tomorrow you wear makeup. Tomorrow you wear a scarf. The heavy swing doors leading to the main corridor squeaked. Ivy flinched so hard she nearly dropped the heavy pan into the sink. She whipped around her wet hands, dripping onto the immaculate slate floor. Carmine stood in the threshold. The boss. The architect of a criminal empire that stretched from the docks to the governor's mansion. He was wearing the trousers of a bespoke dark suit, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, the tie hanging loose. He looked exhausted. The shadows under his dark eyes were heavy, his jaw dusted with coarse stubble. He held a crystal glass with a finger of amber liquid at the bottom. He had come for ice. Or maybe peace and quiet. He certainly hadn't come to find the night maid crying over a sink. Ivy stopped breathing. Her heart hammered a frantic, sickening rhythm against her bruised ribs. She immediately lowered her head, a reflexive gesture of submission ingrained in every person who worked in this house. She turned her face away, trying to hide the left side of her jaw in the shadows of the overhead industrial lights. "I apologize, sir," she whispered, her voice raspy and broken. "I'll be out of your way in a second." Carmine didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on her. The silence in the kitchen stretched heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the harsh drumming of the cold water hitting the steel basin. He didn't step back out. He didn't demand she leave. Instead, he stepped fully into the kitchen. He reached behind him and pushed the heavy oak door shut. Click. He turned the deadbolt. The sound echoed off the tile walls. It was a final trapping sound. Ivy's stomach plummeted. Nobody locked the kitchen doors. There was no reason to. Carmine set his glass down on the central prep island. The clinking of the crystal against the granite was sharp. He walked toward her. He didn't move fast, but there was an undeniable predatory grace to his heavy steps. He wasn't a large, hulking brute. He was lean, carved from years of stress and violence, moving with a quiet efficiency that made him infinitely more dangerous. Ivy pressed her back against the edge of the sink. There was nowhere to go. Her wet hands hovered awkwardly in front of her. He stopped 2 feet away, close enough that she could smell him a sharp, clean scent of expensive soap, undercut by the acrid, lingering odor of cigarette smoke and something metallic. Carmine reached past her. She squeezed her eyes shut, expecting a blow or worse. He simply twisted the faucet handle. The water stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. "Look at me," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone. It wasn't a request. It was an instruction. Ivy kept her chin glued to her chest, trembling violently. "Sir, please. I'm just finishing up. I'm sorry if I disturbed you. Ivy." He knew her name. That fact alone sent a cold spike of terror down her spine. The boss wasn't supposed to know the maids. They were interchangeable. "Look up." Slowly, agonizingly, she lifted her head. She kept her gaze fixed on his collarbone, unable to meet his eyes. Carmine lifted his hand. Ivy flinched, shrinking back. He paused, his hand hovering in the air for a fraction of a second, registering her fear. Then he moved slower, closing the distance until his knuckles brushed against her uninjured cheek. His fingers slid down, catching her chin. His skin was rough, calloused, but his touch was shockingly steady. He tilted her face toward the harsh fluorescent lighting, forcing her to expose the damage. He stared at the swollen purple skin around her eye. He looked at the split lip, the dried blood flaking on her chin. His gaze tracked downward, taking in the torn collar of her uniform and the brutal handprints crushed into her throat. For 10 seconds, Carmine said absolutely nothing. He didn't gasp. He didn't frown. His expression remained terrifyingly blank, a mask of cold, hard stone. But the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Who did this?" he asked. The question was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of a falling anvil. Ivy's throat worked frantically as she tried to swallow. The instinct to lie was absolute. Survival in this world meant keeping your mouth shut. The men who worked for Carmine were vicious. If she snitched, she wouldn't just lose her job. She would likely be found floating in the harbor. "Nobody," she choked out. The lie sounded pathetic even to her own ears. I tripped down the service stairs. I'm clumsy." Carmine's thumb shifted, resting lightly just a fraction of an inch below the deep bruise on her jaw. "You tripped?" "Yes." "You tripped down the stairs, and the stairs grew fingers and choked you." His tone was conversational, devoid of mockery, which somehow made it worse. He was treating her lie with clinical dissecting precision. "I caught my neck on the railing." She whispered, a fresh tear leaking from her good eye. "Please, sir, it's nothing. I'll clean this up and I'll leave." Carmine let go of her chin. He took a step back, sliding both hands into the pockets of his slacks. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the cheap, threadbare fabric of her uniform, the exhaustion carved into her young face, the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating off her in waves. "Do you think I'm a stupid man, Ivy?" No, sir, never." "Then why are you insulting my intelligence in my own house?" He didn't raise his voice, but the rebuke hit her like a physical blow. She wrapped her arms around her waist, instinctively protecting her bruised ribs. "Because I need this job," she blurted out, the panic overriding her filter. "I need the money. If I cause trouble, I'm out. I owe $50,000 in medical bills for my mother. If I don't pay the collection agency, by the end of the year, they take my apartment. If I lose this job, I lose everything." She snapped her mouth shut, horrified by her own outburst. She had just dumped her miserable life story onto a Mafia boss. Carmine watched her. The silence stretched again. He pulled a silver cigarette case from his pocket, flicked it open, and extracted a single cigarette. He placed it between his lips and lit it with a heavy brass lighter. The flame briefly illuminated the cold, hard geometry of his face. He blew a stream of smoke toward the ceiling vents. You think whoever put his hands on you is going to stop because you kept quiet? Carmine asked, his voice cutting through the smoke. Ivy looked at the floor. He was drunk. It was a mistake. Men like that don't make mistakes, Carmine said flatly. They make choices, and they keep making them until someone stops them. He took another drag of the cigarette, his dark eyes never leaving her face. You work for me. You are under my roof. That means you are under my protection. Whether you clean the floors or balance the books, it makes no difference. Someone walked into my house, assaulted my employee, and thought they could walk away with it. That is a problem for me. Ivy shook her head, terrified of the violence lingering just beneath his calm exterior. It didn't happen in the house. It happened out back, by the dumpsters, when I was taking out the trash on my property. Sir, please. Carmine stepped forward again. The space between them vanished. He reached out and gently gripped her shoulder, turning her slightly so she had to look at him. I am not asking you again, Ivy, and I am not giving you a choice. His voice was low, vibrating in his chest. I want a name. Give me the name, and you go back to scrubbing pans, you go home, and you never think about it again. Refuse to give me the name, and I will have my security team pull the perimeter footage from the alley. I will find out who it was by dawn. But if I have to do that, I will fire you before sunrise for lying to me. Ivy's breath caught. He had her trapped. She stared into his eyes, looking for a bluff, looking for any sign that he was just throwing his weight around. But there was nothing but absolute, chilling certainty. Carmine didn't make empty threats. If I tell you, she whispered, her voice shaking so badly she could barely form the words. He'll kill me. He said he would. He won't. He has a gun. He's one of your... She stopped herself, biting her lip. Carmine's eyes narrowed infinitesimally. The shift in his demeanor was microcellular, but the danger spiked. One of my men. It wasn't a question. He had connected the dots. Ivy let out a broken, defeated sigh. Her shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. She was exhausted. She was in pain, and she was completely out of options. Rocco, she breathed into the quiet kitchen. The name hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Rocco. He was a mid-level enforcer, a brute who handled collections on the Lower East Side. He was known for having a heavy hand and a complete lack of impulse control. He was useful to the organization because he was scary, but he was a blunt instrument. Carmine took a slow, deep drag of his cigarette. He exhaled the smoke through his nose, his face completely unreadable. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had just discovered a termite in his floorboards and was calculating the cost of fumigation. Ivy shrank back, expecting him to defend his soldier, to tell her she must have provoked him, or to simply wave it off as collateral damage. She braced herself for the dismissal. Instead, Carmine turned around and walked over to the stainless steel prep table. He crushed the half-smoked cigarette into a heavy glass ashtray, grinding the cherry into black ash with slow, deliberate force. When he turned back to her, the temperature in the room had plummeted entirely. The quiet boss in the rumpled suit was gone. In his place was the apex predator of the city's underworld. Tell me exactly what happened, Carmine commanded. I told you it was... Don't give me the summary, Ivy. Give me the details. He pulled out one of the heavy metal stools from under the island and sat down, leaning his forearms on his thighs, bringing himself closer to her eye level. Look at me. Walk me through it. Start from when you took the trash out. Ivy swallowed hard. The absolute focus he was directing at her was overwhelming, but strangely, it wasn't intimidating anymore. It felt like an anchor. For the first time all night, she didn't feel completely alone. She took a shaky breath and started talking. It was around 1 in the morning. I took the heavy bags out the back service door to the dumpsters. It's dark out there. The bulb over the door has been burnt out for a week. She paused, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. I threw the bags in. When I turned around, he was there. Rocco. He smelled like whiskey. He backed me into the brick wall. Carmine sat perfectly still, absorbing the words. Did he say anything? He said I owed him for letting me work here, that the boss didn't care about the maids, but the soldiers needed to be kept happy. Her voice dropped to a humiliating whisper. He tried to put his hands under my uniform. I fought back. I shoved him. That's when he hit me. She pointed to her eye. He hit me with a closed fist. I fell against the metal railing. He grabbed me by the throat, pulled me up and told me if I screamed, he'd shoot me in the stomach and leave me in the garbage. He told me he'd come back to my apartment on Friday and finish what he started. The silence that followed her confession was absolute. The hum of the industrial refrigerator in the corner suddenly sounded like a jet engine. Carmine looked at the bruising on her neck again. The finger marks. The evidence of a larger, stronger man trying to snap the life out of a woman who was just trying to pay her mother's medical bills. He stood up. The metal stool scraped against the floor, a harsh, violent sound that made Ivy flinch. Carmine didn't walk toward her this time. He walked toward the sink. He reached into the basin, bypassing the copper pan, and pulled out a clean white bar towel. He turned on the hot water, soaking the towel, then wrung it out with extreme precision. He walked back to her and pressed the warm, damp cloth gently against her bleeding lip. Ivy gasped, her hands flying up, but she didn't push him away. The warmth of the towel was a startling contrast to the freezing water she had been using earlier. "Hold this here," he instructed, his voice remarkably calm. Ivy took the towel, pressing it to her mouth, her eyes wide as she watched him. Carmine stepped back and looked at his watch. It was a heavy platinum piece. 3:45 a.m. "You owe $50,000 in medical debt," Carmine stated, not looking up from his watch. "Yes, give the collection agency information to my accountant, Mr. Vance." Carmine paused, his jaw tightening slightly, as if catching a slip of his own tongue. He corrected himself smoothly. "Give it to my accountant, Mr. Rossi, tomorrow morning. The debt will be cleared by noon." Ivy lowered the towel, staring at him in utter shock. "What, sir? No, I can't. I can't accept that. I just want to work." "It wasn't an offer. It's a workplace compensation. You were injured on my property by one of my dogs. I pay for my messes." Carmine walked to the heavy oak door. He reached out and gripped the deadbolt, twisting it with a loud metallic clack. He opened the door, letting the dim light from the hallway spill into the bright kitchen. He stopped in the doorway and looked back at her. His eyes were devoid of any light, a dark, fathomless void that promised absolute destruction. "Lock this door behind me, Ivy." "Sir." "Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me. Do not come out to clean. Sit on that stool and hold that towel to your face until I return." Ivy gripped the edge of the sink, terrified by the deadly calm in his voice. "Where are you going? Please don't do anything that—" "I am going to have a conversation with Rocco," Carmine said softly. "It won't take long." He stepped out into the hallway and pulled the heavy door shut. Ivy stood frozen for 2 seconds before she rushed forward and threw the deadbolt, locking herself in. She backed away from the door, her heart pounding against her ribs, listening to the heavy, deliberate sound of Carmine's footsteps fading down the corridor. The basement kitchen was a tomb. Ivy sat rigidly on the metal stool, the damp towel pressed against her face. She stared at the heavy oak door. The deadbolt was a solid block of brass, sliding deep into the reinforced frame. It was designed to keep people out. Right now, it felt like it was holding the entire world at bay. Time distorted. She didn't know if 10 minutes had passed or an hour. The industrial refrigerator in the corner hummed a low, vibrating drone that rattled in her teeth. Above her, the house was silent. Too silent. This was a sprawling estate built for 50 men. There was always a low murmur of activity, the crunch of gravel in the driveway, the muffled thud of heavy boots on the hardwood floors, the distant brassy chatter of a television in the guard barracks. Tonight there was nothing. The silence had a texture to it. It was thick, deliberate. It was the sound of a house holding its breath. Ivy lowered the towel. The water had gone cold. Her lip had stopped bleeding, but the swelling had worsened, stretching the skin tight across her cheekbone. She hugged her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible on the stool. She strained her ears, listening for a shout, a gunshot, the sound of a scuffle. Nothing. That was the terrifying truth about men like Carmine. They didn't scream. They didn't break furniture. Violence wasn't an emotional outburst for them. It was a transaction. It was administrative. A sudden dull thud reverberated through the ceiling above her. Ivy flinched, her breath catching in her throat. Dust motes danced in the fluorescent light beneath the air vent. It wasn't a loud noise, but it was heavy, like a sack of flour being dropped onto the floorboards. Then silence returned, dead and absolute. She waited. Her hand shook so violently she had to grip the edge of the granite counter to steady herself. Her mind raced with horrifying scenarios. Rocco was a massive man. He had a gun. What if he shot Carmine? What if Carmine was bleeding out upstairs and Rocco was coming down to the kitchen to finish what he started? She looked around for a weapon. The copper pan was still in the sink. A block of chef's knives sat at the end of the island. She didn't move toward them. If Rocco came through that door, a kitchen knife wouldn't save her. Footsteps. They were slow measured and rhythmic. They were coming down the basement stairs, the leather soles of expensive shoes tapping against the concrete. Tap, tap, tap. They stopped outside the heavy oak door. Ivy stopped breathing. Her chest burned. A single rap of knuckles hit the wood. Ivy. It was Carmine. His voice was perfectly level. There was no strain, no breathlessness. He sounded exactly as he had when he asked her for a glass of ice. She slid off the stool, her legs feeling like wet sand. She stumbled toward the door, her fingers fumbling with the brass deadbolt. It clicked loudly. She grabbed the handle and pulled the heavy door open. Carmine stood in the hallway. The dim overhead lighting cast long shadows over his face. He was still wearing the trousers and the unbuttoned white dress shirt. The tie was gone. His jacket was gone. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly tired. Ivy's eyes immediately dropped to his hands. His right hand was tucked casually into his pocket. His left hand hung at his side. The knuckles were raw, scraped violently across the ridges, and the cuff of his pristine white shirt was no longer white. A dark, wet smear of crimson soaked the expensive fabric clinging to the gold cufflink. It wasn't his blood. Ivy stared at it, the reality of what just happened crashing into her. Nausea flared in her stomach. Carmine stepped past her, moving into the bright kitchen. He walked straight to the industrial sink. He turned on the hot water. "Lock the door again," he said over the sound of the running tap. Ivy obeyed, throwing the deadbolt with a trembling hand. When she turned back, Carmine was rolling up his sleeves. He pumped a thick measure of harsh antibacterial dish soap into his palms and began to scrub. He washed his hands with the meticulous, methodical precision of a surgeon. He scrubbed the raw knuckles, the spaces between his fingers, the back of his hands. The water swirling down the drain turned a faint, rusty pink. Ivy stood by the door, completely paralyzed. Carmine reached for a roll of paper towels, dried his hands thoroughly, and tossed the crumpled paper into the trash. He leaned his hips against the sink, crossing his arms over his chest, and looked at her. "Rocco will not be returning to work," Carmine said. He didn't elaborate. He didn't say Rocco was fired. He didn't say Rocco was gone. He just stated a permanent, unalterable fact. Ivy swallowed the lump of terror in her throat. Is he He is no longer a concern of yours." Carmine's tone left zero room for further questions. He looked at her battered face, his dark eyes scanning the swelling. "The ice in the freezer. Get a bag. Put it on your eye before it completely shuts." He pushed himself off the sink and walked toward her. Ivy instinctively stiffened, flattening her back against the door. Carmine stopped. He noticed the flinch, a muscle feathered in his jaw, the only crack in his stoic facade. He didn't reach out to touch her again. He kept a deliberate 3-foot distance between them. "I am going to my study," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "I have calls to make. At 6 o'clock, Gideon will arrive in the accounting office on the 2nd floor. You will go to him. You will hand him your medical bills. Do not leave his office until he hands you a confirmation of a wire transfer. Am I understood?" "Yes," Ivy whispered. "Go to your room. Lock your door. Sleep." He reached past her, not brushing her arm, and unlocked the deadbolt himself. He opened the door, stepped out into the dark hallway, and was gone. Ivy stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the drip of the faucet. The house felt entirely different now. It was no longer just a place she worked. It was a place where a man had bled for putting his hands on her. The morning sun felt offensive. It poured through the narrow, barred windows of the staff quarters, harsh and unforgiving. Ivy sat on the edge of her narrow cot, staring at the small mirror above her cheap plastic dresser. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a profound, aching soreness. Her ribs screamed when she took a deep breath. The left side of her face was a canvas of ugly, mottled purple and yellow. Her lip was split wide, a dark crust of dried blood sealing it shut. She looked like a victim. She hated it. She stood up, pulling on a fresh, clean, grey uniform. She buttoned the collar all the way to the top, wincing, as the stiff fabric scraped against the finger marks on her throat. She tied her hair back tight. She didn't bother with makeup. There was no concealing this. The clock on her nightstand read 6:05 a.m. She stepped out of her room and walked down the long, carpeted corridor toward the main house. The morning shift was already awake. 2 guards, massive men in tailored suits with earpieces, were standing by the coffee station at the end of the hall. Usually they didn't look at her. Or if they did, it was a dismissive, lingering look that made her skin crawl. Today they saw her walking. They saw her face. Both men immediately stopped talking. They didn't stare. They completely averted their eyes, taking a synchronized step backward, pressing themselves closer to the wall to give her a wide, unobstructed path. The air around them practically vibrated with tension. They knew. Word traveled fast in an organization built on whispers. They knew Rocco was gone, and looking at Ivy's face, they knew exactly why. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a woman the boss had violently defended. She was untouchable, radioactive. Ivy kept her head down, her heart pounding, and hurried past them. She climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, her legs heavy. The accounting office was at the end of the hall behind a heavy frosted glass door. Ivy knocked softly. "Come in," a reedy voice called out. Ivy pushed the door open. Gideon sat behind a massive mahogany desk, stacked high with ledgers and 2 glowing computer monitors. He was a thin, nervous man in his 50s, wearing thick glasses and a meticulously pressed vest. He was the only man in the house who didn't carry a gun, but he moved more money than a mid-sized bank. Gideon looked up. When he saw Ivy, he visibly swallowed. His hands hovering over a keyboard, slowly lowered to his desk. "Miss Ivy," he said. His voice was overly polite, strained. She had never spoken to this man. Her meager paycheck was handed out in envelopes by the head housekeeper. Gideon didn't deal with the staff. "Mr. Carmine told me to see you," she said, her voice raspy. Yes, he did." Gideon opened a drawer and pulled out a manila folder. He didn't look at her bruised face. He kept his eyes locked on the edge of his desk. "He called me at 4 in the morning. Made his instructions very clear. Do you have the paperwork?" Ivy reached into the pocket of her apron. Her fingers brushed against the crumpled, terrifying final notice from the collection agency. She pulled it out. It was a piece of paper that had caused her months of insomnia, panic attacks, and starvation. It was the weight that had kept her trapped in this basement. She placed it on his desk. Gideon took it gingerly. He glanced at the numbers. $52,410. To him, it was a rounding error. To her, it was a death sentence. He turned to his computer. He typed rapidly, clicking through screens with clinical efficiency. The silence in the office was broken only by the clattering of his mechanical keyboard. Account number routing, Gideon muttered to himself. He hit a final key. The printer beside his desk whirred to life, spitting out a crisp white page. Gideon took the page, stamped it with a heavy rubber stamp, signed his name at the bottom, and slid it across the desk toward her. "The wire transfer is complete," he said, adjusting his glasses. "The account is settled in full. They will process it by noon. You owe them nothing." Ivy stared at the paper. It felt like a trick. She reached out her fingers, trembling, and picked it up. Transaction approved. Balance $0. A crushing, overwhelming wave of emotion hit her. It wasn't joy, it was grief. It was the sudden release of a pressure she had been carrying for 2 years. Her mother was dead. The debt was gone. She was free. A tear broke loose, sliding down her uninjured cheek. She quickly wiped it away, embarrassed. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me," Gideon said quickly, finally glancing up. His eyes held a mixture of pity and deep-seated fear. "I just type the numbers. The boss gave the order. If I were you, I'd take the day off. I have to work, Miss Ivy," Gideon said, leaning forward slightly. "Nobody in this house expects you to clean today. I have to work," she repeated, her voice hardening. She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her pocket. She couldn't go back to her room. If she sat still, she would shatter. Routine was the only thing keeping her sane. She turned and walked out of the office. Her schedule dictated that she clean the third-floor study at 7. Carmine's study. Usually he was at the docks or in meetings by this time. The room would be empty. She retrieved her cleaning cart from the hallway closet and pushed it quietly down the heavy Persian runners of the 3rd floor. She approached the double doors of the study. They were slightly ajar. She pushed the door open, expecting an empty room. Carmine was sitting behind his massive desk. He hadn't slept. He was still wearing the same clothes, though he had changed his shirt. He was reviewing a stack of manifests, a cold cup of black coffee at his elbow. The morning light hitting him exposed the deep, exhausted lines around his mouth. Ivy froze in the doorway, her hands gripping the handle of the cleaning cart. I apologize. I thought you were gone." "I'll come back." Carmine didn't look up from his papers. "Come in." She hesitated, then slowly pushed the cart into the room. She kept her eyes on the baseboards, retrieving a microfiber cloth and a bottle of polish. She walked toward the large bookshelves, lining the far wall, trying to be completely invisible. The silence stretched. It wasn't the terrifying silence of the kitchen the night before. It was a heavy domestic quiet, the scratch of his pen against the paper, the soft hiss of the polish spraying onto the wood. "Did Gideon sort the ledger?" Carmine asked. Ivy stopped wiping the shelf. "Yes, sir. He gave me the receipt." She turned to face him, keeping her distance. "I don't know how to repay you. You didn't have to do that." Carmine finally looked up. His eyes dragged over her face, assessing the bruising in the harsh daylight. He set his pen down. "I don't want to be repaid," he said flatly. "I don't do favors, Ivy. I manage assets. You are a reliable worker. You are discreet. A desperate employee drowning in debt is a liability. A comfortable employee is loyal. It was a business expense. It was a lie. $50,000 for a maid was not a business expense, but she understood what he was doing. He was giving her an out. He was framing it as a transaction, so she wouldn't feel indebted to a monster. "Still," she said quietly. "Thank you." Carmine stood up. He opened the top drawer of his desk, pulled out a small white tube, and tossed it onto the dark wood. It landed with a soft click. "Arnica," he said. "For the swelling. Put it on twice a day. And don't wear the uniform collar buttoned up to your chin. It's drawing more attention to your neck than if you just left it open." He picked up his coffee cup, walked past her without waiting for a response, and left the study. Ivy walked over to the desk. She picked up the small tube of cream. It was warm from his hand. She held it tight, her bruised chest aching with a strange, confusing rhythm. A week passed. The estate adjusted to the new reality with ruthless efficiency. Rocco's name was never spoken. His locker in the guard barracks was emptied by 2 silent men on a Tuesday morning. His belongings burned in the incinerator out back. He was erased. In this world, you were either useful or you were a memory. Rocco was neither. For Ivy, the shift in the atmosphere was profound. She was a ghost who had suddenly become solid. The invisible barrier around her was impenetrable. If she walked into the kitchen to make tea, the soldiers sitting at the table would immediately stop their conversations, pick up their plates, and leave. Nobody looked her in the eye. Nobody accidentally bumped into her in the narrow hallways. She was safe. Absolutely, unequivocally safe. But the isolation was deafening. She felt like a loaded gun sitting on a coffee table. Everyone knew she was there, and everyone was terrified of setting her off. Her face was healing. The arnica cream worked miracles. The swelling around her eye had reduced to a dull, sickly yellow shadow. The cut on her lip had closed, leaving a small pink scar. The bruises on her throat were fading into faint brown thumbprints. It was a Thursday night, 11 p.m. The house was winding down. Ivy was in the main floor drawing room, a cavernous space filled with leather furniture and heavy drapes. She was polishing the brass fixtures on the fireplace. It was mindless work, the kind of repetitive motion that let her brain shut off. The heavy oak doors of the drawing room clicked open. Ivy didn't flinch anymore. The fear response had been burned out of her. She turned her head, the polishing rag in her hand. Carmine walked in. He was wearing a black tailored suit, the jacket unbuttoned. He looked like he had just returned from a long, grueling evening. He walked straight to the antique crystal decanters on the sideboard, bypassing her entirely. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a glass. Ivy watched him. She should have packed up her supplies and left. That was protocol. You do not linger when the boss enters a room. But she didn't move. Carmine took a sip of the bourbon, turning to face the room. He saw her kneeling by the fireplace. He didn't tell her to leave. He just leaned his hip against the sideboard, holding his glass. "They're avoiding you," he said. It wasn't a question. Ivy sat back on her heels, resting her hands on her thighs. "Yes. Does it bother you?" "It's quiet," she said honestly. "I prefer quiet to the alternative." Carmine swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "They avoid you because they don't know the rules of engagement anymore. You broke the ecosystem. A soldier touched a maid and the soldier vanished. Now they look at you and they don't see a maid. They see a tripwire. Are you angry about that?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. A week ago, she wouldn't have dared ask him a direct question. Carmine looked at her. His gaze was heavy, pinning her to the spot. "If I were angry, I wouldn't have done it." He pushed off the sideboard and walked slowly toward the fireplace. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at her. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting the sharp, unforgiving angles of his jaw. "Stand up," he said. Ivy stood. She wasn't tall, and standing this close to him, the height difference was stark. She had to tilt her head back to look at his face. Carmine reached out. He didn't ask for permission. His hand moved smoothly, deliberately. His fingers brushed against her throat, right over the fading brown bruises. Ivy's breath hitched, but she didn't step back. His touch was incredibly gentle. It was a bizarre contrast to the violence she knew his hands were capable of. "Healing well," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her collarbone. "You gave me the cream." She replied, her voice barely a whisper. The air between them was suddenly thick, crackling with an unspoken tension that had nothing to do with fear. He dropped his hand, taking a half-step back, re-establishing the boundary. But his eyes never left hers. "You asked me last week why I paid your debt." Carmine said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "You didn't believe my answer." "No, I didn't." "You think I did it out of pity." "Did you?" Carmine took another sip of his bourbon. His eyes were dark, calculating. "I don't have pity to spare, Ivy. It's a useless emotion. I did it because I hate leverage. That debt was leverage. It made you desperate. It made you tolerate things you shouldn't have tolerated. It made you let men like Rocco back you into corners because you were afraid of losing your paycheck." He took a step closer. The boundary line blurred again. "I took away the leverage," he continued, his voice dropping lower. "You don't owe the hospital. You don't owe me. If you are in this house, you are here by choice. Not by force. Not by debt." Ivy stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was giving her an exit. The door was wide open. She had no debt. She had savings from her last paycheck. She could walk out the front gates tomorrow morning and never look back. "And if I stay?" she asked. Carmine's jaw tightened. He looked at her mouth, at the small pink scar on her lower lip before meeting her eyes again. "If you stay," he said slowly, every word carrying immense weight, "you understand that you are choosing to stand inside the blast radius. This life does not get softer. The men do not get kinder. I do not get kinder. You killed a man for me," she stated, stripping away the euphemisms. "I killed a rat in my house." He corrected her, though the fire in his eyes betrayed the coldness of his words. "Do not romanticize me, Ivy. I am not a savior." "I know exactly what you are." The absolute certainty in her voice made him pause. He looked at her. Really looked at her, seeing past the grey uniform and the lingering bruises. He saw a woman who had stood in a basement kitchen, bleeding and terrified, and had refused to break. Carmine finished his drink. He set the empty crystal glass on the heavy wooden mantelpiece above her head. His arm brushed her shoulder as he did it. "Finish polishing the brass," he said, his voice entirely devoid of the danger it had held a moment ago. "Then go to bed." He turned and walked out of the drawing room. Ivy stood by the fireplace, the heat radiating against her back. She looked at the door he had just walked through. She thought about her empty apartment across the city. She thought about the freedom the cleared debt gave her. She picked up the polishing rag, knelt back down on the hearth, and began to scrub the brass until it gleamed. She wasn't going anywhere. Autumn bled into winter, and the sprawling estate hardened against the cold. The frost on the windows was thick, blurring the sharp edges of the city beyond the high iron gates. Inside the walls, the ecosystem had entirely reorganized itself around a central, unspoken truth. Ivy was no longer just the maid. She held no official title. She still wore the grey uniform. She still pushed the heavy cleaning cart. But the air around her had fundamentally changed. The guards opened doors for her. The kitchen staff saved her plates of hot food before the soldiers raided the pantry. If a new recruit looked at her a second too long, an older, wiser enforcer would quietly pull him aside and whisper a harsh correction. She was the woman the boss had shed blood for, in their world that made her a living, breathing monument to Carmine's territorial fury. She didn't abuse the power. She simply existed within it. And she stayed. The quiet moments between her and Carmine became the architectural pillars of her new life. They were never planned. They simply happened in the margins of his chaotic, violent schedule. A shared pot of black coffee in the kitchen at 4 in the morning. A silent nod in the hallway when he returned from the docks, his suit smelling of freezing rain and diesel fuel. They didn't discuss Rocco. They didn't discuss the $50,000. They existed in a delicate high-wire act of proximity. It was a Tuesday in late November when the wire snapped. Ivy was in the second-floor linen closet, counting stacks of heavy cotton sheets. The house was relatively quiet. Carmine was downstairs in the formal dining room, meeting with a faction of men from the industrial district. Ivy knew the meeting was tense. The security detail had been tripled, and the men patrolling the grounds carried their rifles openly, no longer bothering to conceal them beneath their coats. She reached for the top shelf to pull down a stack of pillowcases. The explosion didn't sound like a bomb. It sounded like the sky tearing open. A deafening concussive boom violently shook the floorboards. The heavy wooden shelves in the closet splintered, raining heavy white sheets and plaster dust down on her head. The frosted glass fixture on the ceiling shattered, plunging the small room into darkness. Ivy dropped to her knees, her hands flying over her ears as a secondary wave of pressure hit. The house groaned a deep structural agony. Then came the gunfire. It wasn't the rhythmic cinematic popping from television. It was a chaotic, overlapping roar of heavy machinery tearing through drywall and flesh. The concussions reverberated through her chest cavity, rattling her teeth. Someone was screaming downstairs. A wet, ragged sound that ended abruptly, Carmine had warned her. "You are choosing to stand inside the blast radius." She crawled out of the closet, coughing on the thick, acrid cloud of drywall dust that filled the corridor. The emergency lights flickered to life, casting an eerie, sickly yellow glow over the antique wallpaper. Down the hall, the heavy oak doors to the main staircase had been blown off their hinges. Ivy flattened herself against the wall, her breathing shallow and frantic. She had no weapon. She had no training. Her only instinct was a primitive overriding need to survive. She crept toward the back service stairs, her rubber-soled shoes slipping on the debris covering the hardwood floor. Two men in dark tactical gear stepped out of the accounting office at the end of the hall. They weren't Carmine's men. They wore heavy Kevlar vests and carried compact suppressed submachine guns. They saw her immediately. Ivy froze. The dust swirled around them like dirty snow. The lead man raised the barrel of his weapon, centering it squarely on her chest. There was no hesitation, no moral inventory. She was in the house, therefore she was a target. She squeezed her eyes shut. A heavy, booming shot rang out. Not a suppressed whisper. A massive, deafening roar that shook the plaster. Ivy didn't feel anything. She opened her eyes. The man aiming at her was gone, violently thrown backward into the office doorway by the force of the impact. The second man spun around, raising his weapon, but another thunderous shot tore through the corridor, catching him in the shoulder and spinning him to the floor. Carmine stepped out from the smoke at the top of the main staircase. He looked like a nightmare. His suit jacket was gone. His white shirt was soaked in dark, spreading crimson across the left side of his ribcage. In his right hand, he held a massive stainless steel revolver. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated murder. He didn't check the men on the floor. He stepped over the twitching body of the second man and walked straight toward Ivy. The gunfire downstairs was intensifying, a brutal crescendo of violence echoing up the stairwell. Carmine ignored it. He closed the distance between them, his boots crunching loudly over the shattered glass and splintered wood. Ivy was glued to the wall, trembling so violently her teeth chattered. Carmine reached her. He didn't speak. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip tight, bruising. His dark eyes frantically scanned her body, looking for blood, looking for bullet holes. He patted down her arms, checking her back, his hands moving with desperate, rough efficiency. "Are you hit?" he demanded. His voice was a harsh, ragged bark. It wasn't the calm, calculated tone he used for business. It was raw panic. "No!" She gasped, her hands instinctively grabbing his forearms to steady herself. No, I'm okay. I'm okay. Carmine let out a sharp, exhaling breath. The tension in his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, but his grip on her remained ironclad. He looked at the blood soaking his own shirt. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice rising in pitch. "It's a graze, doesn't matter." He shoved the heavy revolver into the waistband of his trousers. He grabbed her hand, lacing his fingers through hers tightly. "We move. Now." He dragged her down the corridor, away from the main staircase. They moved through the labyrinth of the second floor, avoiding the open windows. The house was a war zone. The smell of cordite and copper was suffocating. Smoke billowed up from the lower levels, burning Ivy's eyes. "Who are they?" she choked out, stumbling slightly over a broken lamp. "Dead men," Carmine replied coldly. He pulled her into the master suite, kicking the heavy mahogany door shut behind them. He threw the deadbolt and engaged the reinforced steel bar across the frame. He walked over to the massive fireplace, reached up, and pressed a sequencer into the carved wooden mantel. The heavy stone hearth clicked, swinging outward to reveal a dark, narrow passageway. A panic room, built into the bones of the house for this exact scenario. Carmine stepped back, gesturing toward the dark opening. "Get in." Ivy hesitated, looking at him. His face was pale beneath the layer of soot and dust. The blood on his shirt was spreading, turning the fabric a heavy, wet black. He was losing more blood than a simple graze would produce. "I'm not going in there without you," she said, planting her feet. "Ivy, get in the goddamn room," he snapped, stepping toward her. "The perimeter is breached. It's going to take my men 10 minutes to clear the lower floors. I have to coordinate." "You're bleeding out." "I have survived worse." He grabbed her waist, lifting her physically off the ground to put her into the passageway. She fought him, twisting her body and gripping his lapels. "If you lock me in here, and you die out there, I will never forgive you." She screamed over the sound of a distant explosion. "You brought me into the blast radius. Do not shut me out of it now." Carmine froze. He stared at her, his hands still gripping her waist. Her eyes were wide, terrified, but fiercely defiant. She wasn't the broken maid crying over the kitchen sink anymore. She was forged in the fire he had surrounded her with. The heavy oak door of the bedroom suddenly rattled as someone threw their weight against it from the hallway. Carmine didn't hesitate. He shoved Ivy into the dark, reinforced space of the panic room and stepped in right behind her. He pulled the heavy stone door shut. The loud mechanical clank of the internal locking mechanism engaged, sealing them in absolute pitch-black silence. The chaos of the house instantly vanished, replaced by the heavy, ragged sound of their own breathing. Emergency LED strips flickered on, casting a dim red glow over the small, concrete-lined room. There was a cot, a rack of medical supplies, and a bank of monitors showing security feeds from around the estate. Carmine slumped against the cold concrete wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. The adrenaline was crashing. He dropped his head back, closing his eyes. His breathing was wet and shallow. Ivy dropped to her knees beside him. The defiance evaporated, replaced by cold, clinical dread. "Take the shirt off," she ordered. He opened his eyes, looking at her through the red gloom. A faint, grim smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You're giving the orders now. Take it off, Carmine, or I will cut it off." He didn't have the strength to argue. He fumbled with the buttons with his good hand. Ivy swatted his hand away, her own fingers working frantically to rip the shirt open. The bullet had entered the fleshy part of his left side, just below the ribs, and exited out the back. It hadn't hit an organ, but it had torn through muscle and vein. The blood was flowing freely, pooling on the floor beneath him. Ivy spun around, tearing open the plastic bins on the medical rack. She grabbed heavy gauze pressure bandages and a bottle of medical-grade antiseptic. She dropped back beside him. "This is going to burn," she said, her voice shaking. "Do it." She poured the antiseptic directly into the entry wound. Carmine violently slammed his head back against the concrete. His jaw locked the muscles in his neck, standing out like steel cables. A low, animalistic groan tore through his gritted teeth. His hand shot out blindly, grabbing her thigh, his fingers digging into her leg, hard enough to leave deep bruises. Ivy didn't flinch. She ignored the pain in her leg. She packed the wound with heavy gauze, pressing her hands down with all her body weight to staunch the bleeding. "Look at me," she said, her face inches from his. "Keep your eyes open. Look at me." His dark eyes found hers, hazy with pain. His breathing was rapid. The grip on her leg slowly loosened his hand, sliding down to rest heavily on the floor. "I've got you," she whispered, her hands covered in his blood. "I've got you." In the dim red light of the concrete tomb, surrounded by the muted echoes of his collapsing empire, Carmine looked at the woman, kneeling in his blood. "I know," he rasped. It took 2 hours for the monitors to show the all-clear signal from the security team. The attack had been repelled, but the cost was devastating. The estate was heavily damaged. 6 of Carmine's men were dead. The intruders had been entirely wiped out. The heavy stone door of the panic room ground open. The smell of smoke and death flooded back into the small space. Carmine was stable. The bleeding had stopped under the heavy pressure bandages Ivy had secured. He refused to wait for the private doctor. He pushed himself off the floor, leaning heavily against the concrete wall, his face the color of wet ash. Ivy stood beside him. Her hands were stained rust-red to the wrists. Her grey uniform was ruined. "Let them sweep the upper floors first," she said, reaching out to support his weight. He waved her off, stepping out of the panic room under his own power. "The house is secure. If it wasn't, they wouldn't have signaled." They walked slowly out of the master suite. The hallway was a ruin of shattered glass, splintered wood, and bullet-riddled drywall. Bodies had already been dragged away, leaving wide, dark smears across the hardwood. The silence of the surviving men working to secure the perimeter was heavy and grim. Nobody stopped them. The guards parted, like the sea, keeping their eyes trained on the floor. They saw the blood on the boss. They saw the blood on the maid. They asked 0 questions. Carmine didn't go to his study. He didn't go to the command center. He walked slowly, painfully down the service stairs. He pushed through the swinging doors and walked into the basement kitchen. It was untouched. The heavy oak door had protected it. The stainless steel counters gleamed under the fluorescent lights. It was exactly as it had been months ago. Carmine leaned his good side against the central island, his chest heaving with exertion. He looked exhausted, hollowed out by the violence. Ivy walked over to the industrial sink. She turned on the warm water. She grabbed a bottle of harsh dish soap and began to scrub her hands. The water swirling down the drain turned pink, then dark red, then clear. The mechanical hum of the refrigerator filled the quiet space. Carmine watched her. He watched the rigid set of her shoulders, the methodical way she cleaned the blood from under her fingernails. "You didn't run," he said. His voice was rough, scraping against the quiet. Ivy dried her hands on a clean towel. She turned to face him. She was exhausted, her bones aching with the adrenaline crash. "Where would I go?" There was a gunfight in the hallway. You could have stayed in the closet. You could have hid and waited for the police. You crawled out into the crossfire. I was looking for a way out. "You were looking for me." Ivy dropped the towel onto the counter. She didn't deny it. The time for lies and polite evasions had burned down with the front doors of the estate. She walked over to him, stopping just a foot away. "You told me this life doesn't get softer," she said quietly. "You told me you don't get kinder." Carmine looked down at her. His eyes were dark, fathomless. The mask of the untouchable boss was cracked. He was just a man who had nearly bled to death on a concrete floor. "I told you not to romanticize me. I am exactly the monster you thought I was." "I know." Ivy reached up. Her hands were clean, now smelling of cheap soap. She placed her palm flat against his bare chest, right over his heart. She could feel the heavy, erratic thud of it against his ribs. "But you're my monster now." Carmine closed his eyes. A sharp, shuddering breath escaped his chest. He reached up, covering her hand with his large, calloused one, pressing her palm tighter against his skin. He didn't offer her an escape this time. He didn't tell her the door was open. He knew with absolute certainty that she wouldn't take it. The debt hadn't bound her to him. The violence hadn't driven her away. She had looked at the ugliest, bloodiest parts of his world and chosen to stand beside him anyway. He opened his eyes, the cold predator, returning to his gaze, but it was tempered entirely when he looked at her. "You stay by my side," he ordered, his voice a low, possessive rumble. "No more hiding in the basement, no more uniforms. You belong to me, and anyone who forgets that will end up exactly like the men on the floor, upstairs." Ivy didn't shrink back. She didn't look away. She stepped closer, closing the final inch of space between them, accepting the permanent, terrifying reality of the blast radius. "Understood," she whispered. He leaned down, his mouth brushing against hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, possessive, and tasted like copper and smoke. It was a promise signed in blood, locking the door on the rest of the world forever. And that is how you survive the blast radius. Ivy went from scrubbing pans to holding the heart of the city's most ruthless boss. Did you love this dark, gritty descent into loyalty and violence? If you want more stories where the villains fall harder than the heroes, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to the channel right now. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment between Carmine and Ivy? Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next dark romance.